Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by Dr. Jussi Valtonen. Dr. Valtonen is an author and psychologist from Helsinki. He studied neuropsychology at Johns Hopkins, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He studied screenwriting in the United Kingdom, and he has also worked as a science reporter. We're here today to discuss some of Dr. Valtonen's academic work, including one of his most recent publications, Polypharmacy-Induced Cognitive Dysfunction and Discontinuation of Psychotropic Medication, a Neuropsychological Case Report, as well as his literary work, including his novel, They Know Not What They Do, which won the Finlandia Prize, Finland's highest literary honor. Dr. Valtonen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Just to get into it, firstly, I think listeners would love to hear a little more about your various interests. You are, as I've described, both a psychologist and a novelist. How did you get into each discipline, and how do you believe the two of them feed off each other?
It's true. I've been leading this crazy double life for quite a while, and to be perfectly honest, I was never sure how long I'd be able to pull it off, and it hasn't always been quite easy. I mean, I would strongly recommend against you doing anything like this, because having even one job that's incredibly demanding and monopolizes all your intellectual space, I mean, that would seem more than enough for anybody. But I guess I'm a little bit comforted by some of the examples you can find in the history of literature, like Chekhov, who famously was a medical doctor and also wrote tons of short stories that revolutionized the history of literature and also plays. And so I guess personally, I've found that there's something about science that's incredibly interesting and satisfying and fascinating. I feel like there's also something lacking from the perspective of human experience. I don't know if this is just my personal madness, but it always feels to me like that's just one part of the puzzle, and I kind of feel like you need them both to kind of understand who we are and what we're trying to do.
And can you just talk to me a little bit about what drove the specific research interests that you've developed over your career?
This case report that we published recently wasn't actually anything that I had intended to get into. It was, the way I got into it was actually by accident. SN was one of the last patients I saw when I was still working at the Helsinki City Health Center. I worked there in the psychiatric outpatient services. My job was to conduct cognitive assessments of psychiatric patients. So they often had a psychiatric diagnosis, but they also had some other problem, or there was a worry that something else might be going on, maybe a neurological disease or something like that. SN was just a case with which both Mira Karash, my colleague, and I, and SN herself, we felt it was important to kind of document in some way what had happened to her, so that maybe other people could also get that information and hopefully learn something from it.
Yeah, so just building on that a little bit, this case study that you published I found very fascinating. Just to give our readers a little bit of context, it's about a 31-year-old woman with a doctoral degree and a successful professional career who gradually became forgetful, visually distractible, and unable to function in her normal occupational and social roles after she added lithium in combination with other psychiatric drugs that she'd taken as prescribed for years. So can you talk to us a little bit about the findings and what you felt as though this case study demonstrated?
SN came to us because she was worried that she had dementia or some form of progressive brain disease. She felt like something had clearly changed, and she wasn't able to do many of the things that she was used to doing, and things that had been trivially easy for her. And according to her own recollection, she had never missed a single day of work in her life before these problems began. And she was also, although she had seen therapists on several occasions during her life, her life had been pretty remarkably stable for something like 6 years. So she hadn't really had any abnormal fluctuations in mood or anything that psychiatric side of things that would have worried her terribly. But she was convinced that something about her cognitive functions had changed. And I also met with her partner, who was also really worried and said that something about her has changed, and he was worried also that his wife was developing dementia or something. There were several things that worried both of them. One was that she had started missing really important appointments at work, and she had started forgetting to pick up her kids from their hobbies and that kind of a thing. And also like really enjoyable meetings with friends. She just forgot to go. Something like this occasionally happens to all of us. And so sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to know what's abnormal and what's just, normal. But in her case, just the sheer frequency of things and the importance of the meetings that she was missing were already a little bit worrying. But also in combination with her other complaints, for example, she had become unable to use her online banking system that she had been using for years. And it's something that's trivially easy to use for any neurologically healthy adult, let alone somebody with a PhD and a really demanding job. So she noticed that she had trouble typing in the correct sequences. In fact, had to give all her financial affairs to her partner to take care of because she wasn't able to do them anymore. And then she had to take sick leave from work. So all of this sounded like something serious was probably going on. And so that was the reason why we did the cognitive testing to kind of see whether the test results would corroborate these worries that they had, and then hopefully to try to figure out what was going on and try to help her.
And over the course of your treatment of this patient, she was repeatedly well, this is, I guess, before you treated her, but she was repeatedly clinically misinterpreted, not informed of the risks of the side effects of the drug she was taking, and didn't really know to associate her side effects with her medication. What do you feel that her experience with all of this says about the state of the field of psychiatry?
I think it's really revealing that it literally hadn't occurred to anybody that her taking 4 or 5 different psychiatric drugs simultaneously might have adverse effects on the brain and on her cognition. Before starting lithium, she hadn't been warned that something like this could occur. And that would have been, of course, incredibly important so that she could have noticed it earlier and then have her medication reduced. One of the tricky things, of course, is that it's not clear how much we should worry about things like complaints with memory in every individual case, because as we know, some of that happens to all of us. And there's many authors in the medical literature have argued that the memory problems and the cognitive blurring that people often experience when they're taking lithium, many authors have argued that those are not really things we should worry about, that, the benefits of the medication are so important and the side effects are relatively mild. In her case, of course, that was not true at all, but we also don't know if that was just lithium or if it was lithium in combination with some or all of the other drugs that she was taking. But we do know that polypharmacy in general is associated with a higher risk of iatrogenic damage, both neurological and otherwise. And so it seems a little puzzling to me as a cognitive psychologist that we aren't more cautious about these kinds of effects. If we think about the substantial proportion of people now who are taking psychiatric drugs, often several of them over the long term, and that in combination with the lack of high quality research evidence about what those drugs might do to the brain over the long term, that does seem worrying to me.
And could you talk to me a little bit more about your perception of the risks of polypharmacy? I heard you getting into it a little bit, but I'd love to hear you expand on that.
First of all, we don't really have as much research evidence on even on the individual psychiatric drugs that many people are taking now. Most of the research evidence that we have is, of course, coming from studies that have been conducted over the short term only. And looking at their long-term effects is much trickier and much more expensive and harder to do. In the case of lithium, for example, you can actually find experimental studies looking at lithium's effects on cognitive processes on healthy human participants, just volunteers who have volunteered to take the drug for a while. And then when the drug is discontinued, we can see how the cognitive functions recover. But it would be ethically incredibly problematic to do that over, something like 5 years with a really large group of participants. So we don't really have all that evidence, or we have less of it than you'd hope. And of course, once you factor in different combinations of several different drugs, of course, the situation becomes even more complicated. So I hope we'd have more and better quality evidence on all of that, but we unfortunately don't.
And do you hope or anticipate that this work will cause a larger body of research into polypharmacy to follow?
I don't think an individual case report will really, they're often the least significant category of medical research you can conduct. So, probably not. But in our case, when we were looking at the medical literature, when we were trying to figure out together with SN what might be causing her problems, some of the published case reports turned out to be really important for us, because we noticed that there were other people who also had developed cognitive problems, sometimes very severe ones, during long-term administration of lithium. And we also noticed that there were several cases that had been published already earlier where the patients had been misdiagnosed and treated as dementia patients. And then, in some of those cases, the lithium was discontinued for some other reason, and the patient improved. And only then the treating team realized it was probably what had been causing the problem all along. But I think there is a kind of a general interest towards deprescribing and kind of thinking about whether in some cases it might be helpful to just think about reducing the number of drugs the population is using in general. So hopefully that trend will continue to be investigated further.
And as you bring up, this is, of course, a case study with an N of 1, which comes with certain limitations, as you've discussed already. So why did you feel it was important to publish this particular piece, even with those limitations in mind?
For me, one of the really kind of impactful things about SN's case, of course, I followed her really closely for a long time. And so, her case was important to me personally, but also one of the really impactful things about her case is that none of the problems that she had in her life, at least in retrospect, none of them seemed that severe. Like, she had never experienced any psychiatric symptoms that would have been really extreme, or kind of where you kind of go, aha, I understand now why she was prescribed all those drugs. And, they must have wanted to do something to alleviate the pain in some way. She's a person who had always done incredibly well in her life. She had received the highest grades in school, and she had performed really well in a really demanding job. And, all she really had wanted was to talk to a therapist about her life and about her future plans and about her marriage and stuff like that. Kind of everyday life seeming things. And so if a person like this enters the mental health system and becomes medicated to the point of disability and becomes unable to function both socially and professionally, that seems really alarming to me. But it just seems to me like that's one of the really clear examples of how the system, there must be some kinds of blind spots in the system for it to go this badly wrong in a case like this. And that, I should also mention that her cognitive deficits were not incredibly extreme. If you look at the medical literature, there are people who have had much, much worse cognitive deficits, and so, her story is also has a fairly happy ending, so to speak. But still, you can ask what the system was trying to do with her and why it went so badly wrong.
And transitioning out of this particular piece a little bit, what sorts of challenges do you believe there are, both from your personal experience and from observation of the field at large in doing research on the negative impact of certain psychiatric drugs?
That's a really, really good and important question, and also a fairly broad one.
Yeah.
It does seem like we have been culturally telling ourselves a story about scientific breakthroughs and these revolutionary treatments that we now have in psychiatry, and about how neuroscience is changing the field, and how we've become much, much closer to understanding how the brain works, and the kinds of aberrations in brain processes that might help explain what mental illness is, and so forth. I wonder if just the fact that this is the story that we have been telling ourselves and each other as a culture, I wonder if this is a story that kind of simultaneously prevents us from asking some of these important questions. So if that's the story you're telling yourself, about really incredibly precise, very targeted interventions in the brain, it's kind of hard to simultaneously start asking what we actually know about the long-term effects of these drugs and how they actually affect the brain. And so maybe one of the things I'm hoping for would be a kind of a more scientifically grounded or a more realistic cultural appreciation of what we do know about the brain and what we do know about these drugs, and kind of a more balanced take on things in general.
And what is your perception generally on how the media covers psychiatry? Both, you can probably speak to both Finnish and American media coverage, and whether there's any difference there as well.
I think there probably is a big difference in that the U.S. being such a large country, it would be impossible to kind of sustain one narrative that would be shared among everybody in the whole country. So there's clearly a lot more variance and different kinds of media outlets that can sometimes find very different pieces of information. And of course, Mad in America is one of those media outlets that kind of has found an angle that nobody else is really doing in that way, and is trying to highlight some of the research evidence that otherwise may go missing or unnoticed. And I guess one of the things about living in a really tiny country like Finland with only like 5 or 6 million people, you don't get that variety of different media outlets, or even the variety of different opinions and different research approaches. You often end up with a handful of experts in any given field whose voices are often heard very well. And the Swedes actually even have a word for it, and it translates to something like the opinion corridor. And there's kind of like a range of opinions on most things, a range of opinions that are socially acceptable or socially allowed. And I think any big country like the US is probably more accepting of different differences of opinion.
I'm going to transition to discussing your book, which talks about some of this stuff anyways. So first things, can you just kind of describe why you wrote They Know Not What They Do? What was so important that needed to be told in that novel form?
That's a fantastic question, and I wish I had an answer to that question. The nature of the process is somewhat different. I think if I had asked myself that question, I probably would never have started writing it at all. The process was more along the lines of, let's just see where this goes. Let's see what happens if I try doing this. But in hindsight, I think one of the motivations for starting to write the stuff that I began writing, which ended up being the first part of the novel, I think I was probably personally trying to understand some of my own experiences after coming back from the US, where I'd done some of my dissertation work. And it was kind of a textbook case of reverse culture shock. And people had warned me about that in advance, and I kind of knew about it, but I was still surprised at what happened to me. So once you spend a longer period of time abroad, when you return, you kind of do see your own country differently from before. And it's a cliche, but it is shocking. And so I think that experience kind of motivated me into trying to imagine what that country would look like through the eyes of somebody else who came from the US and had a very different background.
The book, I feel, has a lot of interesting themes, and I don't think we're going to be able to pull all of them out right now. But one of the interesting themes that you do bring up right now is that there is sort of this difference between American and Finnish cultures, whether that's real or perceived difference. And that's certainly a struggle for several of the protagonists. So as someone with a foot in each world, what can you tell me about that difference, whether it's real, perceived? Any thoughts you have on that?
Well, first of all, I think probably the real differences were more real several decades ago. So the beginning of the book is set in the early or mid 90s, during which Finland was facing a historically bad economic depression, and so that's part of the social context into which my American protagonist Joe enters into. And since then, of course, the world has globalized and become much more connected through the internet. And young people growing up would probably learn really good English now, even if they didn't go to school in Finland, because they're following YouTube and they're on the internet all the time. And so things in many ways have changed. But I also think just the sheer number of people and the diversity of people with different cultural and ethnic and religious backgrounds, and just the diversity of opinions. And that alone, I think, makes the US a really special place still, when you compare it to a tiny European country like Finland. And Finland actually is also, because Finland is a little bit more isolated from the other Nordic countries than the others are, because the Finnish language is not related to any of the other Nordic languages at all. And I think that also keeps us a little bit separate from the other Nordic countries.
And I think you touched on this a little bit, but another theme in the book is this obsession, sort of bordering on addiction to technology. And at one point, a character, I'm trying not to spoil anything here, so I'm going to be vague, but a character is trying to stop using this pretty spectacular technological device, and he bemoans I'll read a passage directly that I found interesting. It says, "He has to generate every thought and impression by himself from beginning to end. How onerous. And worst of all, not a single thought seems to lead anywhere unless he puts active effort into it. No menus open, nothing reacts to his wishes, nor does concentrating on any object bring it to life in a series of increasingly specific choices." So that's a loaded passage, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little more on the social commentary that underlies it.
Yeah, the novel is obviously really interested in our technologically driven culture and why we're so obsessed with these devices that we're now using all the time. And I guess one of the questions the novel is trying to kind of ask is whether this increasingly rapid access to all these enormous amounts of information, whether that really helps us to understand each other better or not. And I think one of the things in the passage that you just read is related to how much mental work it requires if you do something like try to create a world of your own in your writing, or produce something in your research that hasn't existed before. And it requires an enormous amount of mental energy. Whereas these devices that we're using, I mean, they're designed to satisfy us, and we become these passive passengers who enjoy the ride. But once you take the device away, you're like, am I really supposed to do all this thinking by myself? Like, do I have to imagine things? Like, that's so much work.
And I think something interesting that you highlight about this rapid technological advancement is that not only is there danger, but there's also a lot of potential. I mean, some research that I just read was the potential uses of machine learning, including like predicting the risk of suicide and psychosis, to me, which is very interesting and exciting, but also very, very scary research. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this duality.
I completely agree with you. There's a duality that is that promises a lot and could potentially be incredibly helpful and useful, but it's also scary. And I think one of the reasons why it's scary is that we don't seem to really, I don't know if this would even be possible, but we, at least in practice, we don't really seem to first have a very thorough social debate over, here's this new device or this new technology that somebody invented. Let's talk about what the pros and cons are, and let's try to decide together whether we should start using it or not, or what the rules and regulations or checks and balances should be. We just start using them. I mean, they're on the market, and then you hear that somebody has bought it, and legislation is far behind, and then only gradually do we start to discover what the potential dangers and problems are. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical about, or maybe I would just prefer a little bit of a slower pace in which we'd have more time to kind of discuss what's going on and how the world is changing and what we think is actually in our best interests as a society and as human beings.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of a related theme, but another theme that I was pulling out from your book is about research ethics and how, for some folks, the ethics of research can become blurred when they perceive that the end result justifies the means of getting that result. And so I'm curious as to whether that interest is a theme from your own work and how you see those themes popping up in the work around you.
I think it is a really interesting theme. I never thought about writing a novel that would address that theme per se or do it in a direct way. But what I had noticed was that in a lot of novels, and especially films, I guess, if you see researchers or scientists, they're often depicted in this incredibly idealized way in which they're not, they're sometimes even just, half human, and they're kind of above all like the petty considerations that you and I might have in our everyday lives. And I guess that was something that I kind of wanted to write against. And it seems to me that doing research is kind of in some ways, kind of like a job like any other job. And you learn to do what your mentors do and what your peers do, and you kind of see who becomes successful and what they did to become successful. And it's, in a lot of cases, I think research ethics is not something that people kind of, ponder over every day and kind of try to make these idealized decisions in the abstract. It's more kind of like, this is how we typically do it. Then you send the form to the IRB, and it becomes it's your job. And so part of it is just that you can't afford to start thinking really deep philosophical questions every day about your day job. You just can't afford to do that. And so that obviously creates the possibility that if things start gradually going wrong, like as a system, that people start doing something that becomes normal but is actually ethically problematic, you can find yourself in a situation where there's a systemic problem and nobody really notices it.
That reminds me of sort of this subplot that's developing in the book where Joe is waging war against the publishing company. I can't remember the name of the conglomerate in there, but he's just kind of constantly waging this battle against essentially the corporatization of scientific literature. And all the while, people are losing their jobs, and he's paying half attention in these meetings, and so he's trying to do what he perceives as the good and the moral and the just thing. But there's a lot more going on there. So is that sort of in your mind, a warning on what is to come, or where did that idea come from?
It's a very real concern. I mean, some of the academic publishers are their subscription fees are clearly not sustainable, and sometimes people will end up boycotting some of these publishers just because they find that their demands are unreasonable. But I guess in that novel, and for me more generally, it's one of those things where I think it's easy to now, living in this society today, it just feels like there are all these different societal problems that are kind of just attacking you from all sides, and there are different sizes, and some of them are more national and some of them are more global, and some of them seem more devastating than others, but there are all these systemic problems. And it kind of seems like if you wanted to be a really ethical, good person, you'd have to use a lot of the time that you spend awake, you'd spend battling all these different battles. And that's one of them for Joe, but you could easily come up with 10 others that would feel equally important.
Yeah, that's sort of an exhausting battle that he faces throughout the book, and I kind of felt that parallel to my own life. So I thought that was a very interesting thing of you to bring up. The last sort of book-related question I have is actually not my own writing. I was reading Anna Patterson's review of your book. I'm not sure if you've read it, but she said towards the end of it that, and I'm quoting here, "The darkness of the satire is very much Valtonen's own, and it grows pitch black towards the end when it becomes clear that we are ready as ever to kill those who might save us." I found that to be a very profound statement, but I was curious as to whether you agreed with that conceptualization of your work.
I like that conceptualization. I'm not sure if it was one that, if it was my interpretation of the work. I mean, I clearly see why she says that, and I think it's consistent with the work. But I guess for me personally, what was always most important about the relationship between the father and the son was whether they would be able to find common ground, whether they'd be able to find each other and have a reasonable adult conversation together, and whether they would be able to understand each other even a little bit. And that to me felt more important than the sequence of events that then unfolds during the ending.
And I can feel you're careful around spoilers as well. But last question about the book is just, if you say someone puts down your book, finishes reading it, what's the one lesson or the one thought that you want to be tumbling around their brains when they're done reading it?
That's obviously something for the reader. I would hate to be, it's kind of tempting to imagine that I'd be the person who'd be able to.
I'm hoping to tempt you here.
Take that. Yeah, I guess I'm the kind of an author who'd rather hear from the reader what it was for them. What was it for you? What was tumbling around your brain after?
Oh, well, I've shared several of those things already, I think, but the most interesting one for me was the sort of duality of the difference between the potential and the danger of technological advancement. I felt that you could feel it kind of coming in waves. You could see it happening in Joe versus what was happening in his older colleagues versus what was happening in his children. And it felt really to me like a red flag being thrown into the air of we're running into this darkness and we can't see very far ahead. So maybe let's pump the brakes a little bit. And so I was thinking a lot about that because I have been in the past someone who has been really interested in these sort of technologies. That I worked in a suicide prevention lab for a couple of years prior to coming to grad school, and we were very interested in using technology to predict suicide. And I got sort of really deep into that headspace. But now I'm taking some steps back and sort of realizing both the danger and the excitement and the possibility of these sorts of technological inventions. So that was one of the ones for me. I could talk to you for an hour about about the other ones, but that was the biggest takeaway for me, I think.
What I think is beautiful about fiction is that everybody takes slightly different things away from them. And if you read a whole novel, some of your thoughts will be the same as with another reader, but some of them will be completely different. And for me, that's part of the beauty of it.
I think that's a very interesting parallel to run along your more academic work, which is why I was so interested to talk to you about all this. But I do just have one more question for you today, which is just thinking about your next steps, both in terms of your academic and your literary pursuits. As we sit here today, what do you feel passionate about? What do you feel as important to investigate from your perspective?
Well, one of the things that I've been really excited about recently is something that we've been talking about with Brad Lewis, who is at NYU, and he does narrative psychiatry. And Brad is a really fascinating guy. And I met him when I was doing a postdoc at NYU. I had known about his work, and I had read his book. It's titled Narrative Psychiatry, which I would highly recommend. And I had just decided that once I get to New York, I'll just email him and ask him if he has time to meet me. And he did. And he was really friendly and very generous with his time. And I actually ended up auditing a couple of his classes, and we talked about a lot of stuff. And one of the things we ended up talking about was functional neuroimaging studies of depression, and a particular short story that Chekhov wrote in the 1880s. And we kind of started thinking about what Chekhov would say about the functional neuroimaging of depression. And we're tentatively working on a project in which that's exactly what we're kind of trying to figure out. Or we're using Chekhov's short story to kind of think with it about what it means to think about something like depression in biological terms or more holistic terms. And I think the kind of bringing the arts into this conversation feels useful to me for some reason. I don't know if anybody else will pay any attention to it, but it seems like Brad and I are both really fascinated about this.
Well, that seems like a super fascinating topic. I'm curious as to how does one even begin that work? What does the day-to-day of that work look like?
A lot of it involved Brad and I talking over lunch or coffee about Chekhov and about depression and about neuroscience. But I guess one way to start would be to read that story. It's titled A Nervous Breakdown, and it's about a young man, a law student named Vasilyev, who experiences something that gets to be called a nervous breakdown, and his friends take him to see a psychiatrist. And it's a fantastic story. I'd highly recommend it.
I'll add that to my list too, and I will keep my eyes out for everything that you will have to come. I just want to thank you again for your time in chatting with me today. I'm very appreciative of the work you do and for taking the time out of your day to talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.